She walked in wearing a dress she'd stitched with her own hands. She walked out wearing a stranger's jacket and carrying wounds no needle could ever close. On Valentine's Day in Seoul, Zuri Bennett believed she was finally getting her chance. Instead, she got a room full of cameras, a crowd hungry for cruelty, and a man who looked at her like she was something that had crawled in from the street. But what that crowd didn't know, what nobody in that glittering, poisonous room could have predicted, was who was about to walk through that door. Stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The dress had taken her 11 days. Zuri Bennett had counted every one of them. 11 days of skipping lunch to save fabric money. 11 days of hunching over her secondhand sewing machine in a dormitory room barely wide enough to turn around in, the radiator hissing and spitting all night while her roommate complained about the light. 11 days of pricking her fingers until the inside of her right thumb was a geography of tiny scars. The emerald silk had cost more than she should have spent. She knew that the moment she paid for it, standing in the fabric district with the money she'd been setting aside since October, the money she'd told herself was for new drafting paper, for better scissors, for the kind of professional tools a serious fashion design student was supposed to own. She'd spent it on 4 yards of deep green instead, and she hadn't apologized to herself for it, not once. The dress was worth it. She'd known that the second she pulled it over her body and stood in front of the small mirror propped against her desk. It fit her the way she'd always believed clothes were supposed to fit, not minimizing, not restructuring, not apologizing. It followed the actual shape of her body, wide hips and full chest and all, and the emerald made her dark skin look like something worth looking at, something rare. She'd stood there for a long moment, turned slightly to check the seam at the side she'd been most worried about, and allowed herself exactly one thought before she forced herself to stop. I made something beautiful. That was 2 hours before everything fell apart. Mira had set it up. Zuri should have questioned it more. She knew that later, would know it with the sharp, nauseating clarity of hindsight for a very long time after. Mira Seo had been her classmate for 2 years. Not a close friend exactly, but the kind of person you eat lunch with sometimes. The kind who texts you memes and occasionally borrows your color pencils without asking. Mira had seemed delighted when she approached Zuri 3 days before Valentine's Day, speaking quickly, smiling too wide, telling her about this man, this really successful man, a businessman, older, sophisticated, who had seen Zuri's design work somewhere and wanted to meet her. He specifically asked about you, Mira had said, tilting her head like she was doing Zuri a favor so large it barely fit through the door. Zuri had hesitated. She was good at hesitating. 24 years of being the only black girl in most rooms she'd entered had trained her to hesitate, to scan, to calculate how much of herself it was safe to offer before she understood the landscape. But she'd been lonely that winter, the kind of lonely that settles into your bones when you've been far from home long enough. When Seoul's streets are beautiful and cold and full of people who look past you rather than at you. The kind of lonely that makes a blind date set up by a classmate sound like a reasonable risk rather than the obvious trap it was. She'd said yes. The restaurant was called Swar. It sat on a quiet street in Gangnam, in a building that had clearly been expensive before anyone put a restaurant inside it, all polished stone and glass, warm amber light spilling through tall windows onto the pavement outside. Zuri stood on the sidewalk for a moment before going in, feeling the cold February air against her bare arms. She hadn't brought a coat that would do the dress justice, and took one breath that fogged in front of her face. The maitre d' looked at her the way people sometimes looked at her in places like this. A quick assessment, top to bottom, the kind of look that isn't quite a question, but is also not a welcome. She gave him Mira's name and the reservation, and he led her inside. The room was full. That was the first thing she registered. How full it was for a Tuesday evening. How many people had come out on Valentine's Day to sit in this particular restaurant. Round tables dressed in white linen, candles, the soft sound of silverware and low conversation. She followed the maitre d' between the tables, aware of her heels on the stone floor, aware of the slight turn of heads that followed her. She told herself it was the dress. She'd been told her whole life that she made room shift direction. The man was already standing when she arrived at the table. He was exactly what Mira had described, and nothing more. Handsome in an obvious, practiced way, the kind of handsome that comes with money and a good tailor. Dark suit, good watch, hair that had been arranged rather than simply combed. He was smiling as she approached, and for exactly 2 seconds, Zuri felt the small flutter of something optimistic. Then she got close enough to see the smile change. It didn't disappear immediately. It contracted first, tightened at the corners, became something that looked like a smile from a distance but functioned, up close, like a door swinging shut. His eyes moved down and then back up, and whatever he found in that inventory made him set his jaw in a way that Zuri's body understood before her mind caught up. She was still a step away from the table when he spoke. He didn't lower his voice. That was what she would remember most, later. Not the words themselves, she would spend years trying to half forget the exact words, but the volume. The deliberate, casual, almost lazy volume of a man who had decided he had an audience and was going to use it. "You're joking," he said. She stopped. "Is this some kind of joke?" He stepped back from the table slightly, creating distance as though proximity itself was an insult he couldn't afford. "I was told," he laughed, short and sharp, a sound like something breaking. "I was told I was meeting someone, not—" He gestured at her, hand moving in a slow, loose arc that encompassed all of her, everything. "Not this." The room had already begun to turn. Zuri could feel it the way you feel weather changing, a pressure shift, a collective inhale. The conversation around them hadn't stopped entirely, but it had thinned, stretched, become something people were doing with only part of their attention. "Your skin," he continued, his Korean carrying the particular confidence of someone who has never been told to stop, "is not what I expected. And your—" He searched for the word with theatrical patience. "Your figure. I don't know what you were told about me, but I have a reputation to maintain." Someone laughed. Zuri didn't know who. She didn't turn to look. Her face was doing something she wasn't controlling. She could feel it, the way your face does things at moments like these while you're still trying to catch up to what's actually happening. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were burning, and she refused to let them. She was still standing in the same spot she'd stopped in, one hand slightly raised from having been about to reach out toward the table, suspended there like a question nobody was going to answer. "You should go," the man said, already turning back to his chair like the matter was settled. "Before you embarrass yourself more than you already have." That was when she heard Mira. The laugh came from 2 tables over, high and bright and real, the laugh of someone who had been holding it in and couldn't anymore. Zuri turned, and there was Mira Seo, sitting with a group of women Zuri didn't recognize, a phone held up and angled, the small red dot of a live stream visible on the screen. "Mira." Zuri heard her own voice come out flat, abraded, like it had been dragged across something rough on the way out. "Oh, don't be upset," Mira said, still smiling, tilting the phone slightly to keep Zuri in frame. "You won the competition. You got the recognition. I just wanted everyone to see what Zuri Bennett actually looks like when she steps into the real world." She paused for effect. This is the real world, by the way. Not a design classroom where professors feel bad for you. The competition. 6 weeks ago, Zuri's collection had won the university's annual fashion showcase, a prestigious competition that came with a scholarship extension and an internship offer from a design house that Mira had wanted since her first year. The faculty had chosen Zuri unanimously. Mira had smiled at the announcement and texted her congratulations that evening, and apparently spent every night since planning this. The people around Mira's table were watching now. Some of them had their own phones out. Across the restaurant, Zuri could see the red dots multiplying, little points of light in the dimness like something that hunts in packs. Then the insults came not from one direction, but from everywhere. It happened fast, the way mobs happen fast, the way cruelty accelerates once it has a room's permission. A woman in a red dress at the table nearest her said something about Zuri's figure and whether the restaurant's chairs could handle it. That made her table erupt. A man in his 50s, gray at the temples and expensive all over, leaned back in his seat and tossed a comment about skin tone and standards into the air with the casual ease of someone who had made that joke before and been rewarded for it. Someone else said something about the dress. Her dress. The dress she had spent 11 days building, the dress she had believed was beautiful, and described it as something a woman of her type should know better than to wear in public. Someone threw money. She didn't see who, but she heard it, the flutter and slap of bills hitting the stone floor around her feet. And then someone else added more, a handful of coins that scattered and rang and rolled. "For a gym membership," a voice called out, and the laughter surged. Zuri stood in the middle of it and did not move. She was still standing. She didn't know why that felt important, but it did. Her hands had dropped to her sides. Her chin was up by instinct, not by choice. Her body had made that decision without consulting her. And she was breathing through her nose in short, controlled increments that were costing her more than anything she'd spent money on in her life. The restaurant manager appeared from somewhere to her left. He was a lean man in a dark vest, somewhere in his 50s, with the practiced composure of someone who had learned to smooth over scenes rather than stop them. He came to stand beside her, rather than between her and the room, which told her immediately what was coming. "Miss," he said, his voice quiet in a way that was not kind, "I'm going to have to ask you to step outside. You're causing a disturbance for our guests." She looked at him. "I haven't done anything." "I understand." His tone suggested he did not understand and had not tried. "But our guests have paid for a certain experience this evening, and your guests are recording a person being publicly humiliated in your restaurant, and you're asking me to leave." His jaw moved. "Miss, if you don't leave voluntarily, I'll have no choice but to involve the authorities. Additionally, there's the matter of the disruption you've caused." "There's no matter," Zuri said. Her voice was steady in a way that frightened her slightly, because she wasn't sure how long she could sustain it. "I came here for a dinner reservation. I have not disrupted anything." The other guests disagree. He gestured vaguely at the room behind her, as though the room itself was a document she could be shown. "We may also need to discuss compensation for the experience." "Compensation." She repeated the word like she was turning it over to look for the part that made sense. "For the disturbance." He was serious. She could see that. The manager of this restaurant, in this city, on Valentine's Day, surrounded by people currently recording a black woman being insulted from every direction, was standing beside her and asking her to pay for the privilege. She felt something move through her then that wasn't sadness. It wasn't quite rage either. It was something older and quieter and more dangerous than either of those, something that had been building in her chest since she was 14 years old, and a girl at school had pulled her ponytail and asked if it was real, and the teacher had told Zuri to stop making a scene. It was the particular exhaustion of a person who has been told, in 1,000 different languages across 2 continents, that their presence is the problem. She thought about leaving. She considered it seriously, cataloged it as an option, felt the pull of it, the door, the cold air, the sidewalk, the anonymity of just being a woman in a coat, walking quickly away from something. Nobody would blame her. Everybody would understand. She had already lost everything there was to lose in that room, and the cost of leaving was nothing compared to the cost of staying another minute in that light. She was still calculating this when she looked down at the bills scattered around her shoes. Her emerald dress caught the candlelight at the hemline. She crouched down. Not because she wanted the money, not because she was accepting any part of what was being offered, but because her legs suddenly needed something to do, and the alternative was shaking, and she refused to shake in front of these people. She gathered the nearest bill between 2 fingers, held it, looked at it, felt the complete and total humiliation of the thing wash over her like a wave she'd been waiting for, and held herself there in the bottom of it. The room had shifted slightly. Not in tone, the laughter was still moving around the edges, but in direction. People were repositioning to film her crouching on the floor. She was aware of the angles they were choosing. She was a fashion designer. She understood composition. She understood exactly what this image would look like on a screen, what story it would tell, how cleanly it would confirm every assumption the people in this room were currently celebrating. She placed the bill back on the floor. She was not going to be seen gathering it. She began to stand. And then the music stopped. Not faded, stopped. Mid-song, mid-note, as though the sound had been cut with something sharp. The laughter stuttered. The conversation died in sections, table by table, rolling toward the entrance the way silence always rolls toward something that causes it. Zuri was still half crouched when she felt the room change temperature. Not literally, but something shifted in the air that raised the hair on her arms and made the manager beside her go very, very still. She turned toward the entrance. 5 men in black suits had come through the door. They moved with the unhurried precision of people who have never once had to rush to be taken seriously, spacing themselves in a loose formation that blocked the entrance without appearing to block it, hands at their sides, faces giving nothing. Behind them, stepping through the doorway a half-second after, came someone else entirely. The man who entered last was not the largest in the group. He was not shouting, not gesturing, not doing anything that should have commanded the silence that fell over the room the moment he stepped into it. He was simply there, in a dark suit that fit him like a second skeleton, with eyes that moved across the space with the slow, methodical patience of someone taking inventory of everything before deciding what to do about any of it. Those eyes found the scattered money on the floor. They found the phones. They found Mira, still holding hers up, though her hand had lowered several inches without her seeming to notice. Then they found Zuri, still half crouched, green dress, bare arms, face that had been through 11 days of hope and 2 hours of fire, eyes that were burning but dry, because she had refused to let them be anything else. The man in the black suit looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something nobody in that restaurant could have anticipated. He reached up without looking away from her and began to remove his jacket. The jacket came off his shoulders the way expensive things move, without effort, without ceremony, as though the gesture had already been decided long before he walked through the door. Nobody in the restaurant said a word. Zuri was still half crouched when the man crossed the room toward her. She registered his approach the way you register something your body understands before your mind catches up. A change in pressure, a shift in the air's attention. She straightened slowly, because crouching felt worse now than standing, and she was not going to be found on the floor by whoever this was. He stopped in front of her. Up close, he was somewhere in his early 30s, with a face that had been through things it wasn't going to discuss. Not handsome in the practiced, preening way of the man who had humiliated her. This was something else, something that had been carved rather than arranged. A jaw that held tension without showing it. Eyes that were dark and absolutely still, the kind of still that isn't calm so much as controlled, the way water is still on top when something is moving hard underneath. He held the jacket out toward her, not draped over his arm the way a waiter offers a coat, extended toward her directly, as though what he was offering was a choice rather than a gesture. She didn't take it immediately. She looked at it, then at him, and her expression said clearly that she was not going to accept anything from a stranger in this room without understanding what it was going to cost her, because everything in this room had cost her something tonight. "I don't know you," she said. Her voice came out lower than she intended, rough at the edges. "No," he said. His Korean was precise, unhurried. "You don't." "Then I don't want your jacket." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, more like the acknowledgement of one. "I know," he said. "Take it anyway." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds in which the entire restaurant sat in a silence so complete she could hear the candle flame nearest to her working against a draft. Then she reached out and took the jacket, because her arms were cold and she was exhausted. And sometimes you take the jacket because the alternative is standing there, making a point to an audience that has already decided you don't have any. She draped it over her own shoulders rather than putting her arms through the sleeves. That distinction felt important. Wearing someone else's armor and choosing your own posture inside it were 2 different things. The man turned around then, turned to face the room. And the room, this room full of cameras and laughter and scattered money and a live stream that was still, technically, running, contracted. She watched it happen from behind him, watched shoulders pull back toward chairs, watched the man who had humiliated her, still standing near their assigned table, lose approximately 3 inches of height without moving at all. Watched Mira's phone hand drop another few inches, the red dot still blinking, but the angle now pointed somewhere safe and non-committal, like the floor. One of the 5 men in black suits moved to the manager's side. He didn't say anything. He simply stood there, close enough to be a message, and the manager's face changed in the particular way faces change when the calculation they're running produces a number they don't like. The man who had given Zuri his jacket stood in the center of the room with his hands loose at his sides and said, in a voice that was quiet enough that people had to stop whatever they were doing to hear it, "Put the phones down." It wasn't a request. It wasn't quite a command either. It was the kind of statement that exists in the space between those two things, where actual authority lives. Phones lowered. Not all at once. A few people needed a second to process, to recalibrate, to weigh what they thought they knew about this moment against the evidence currently standing in front of them. But they went down. Mira's went down last, and even then she didn't lock the screen immediately. The red dot blinked twice more before it went dark. The man in the dark suit. No jacket now, just a white dress shirt and the particular posture of someone who has never once in his adult life needed a jacket to be taken seriously, looked at the man who had humiliated Zuri. Looked at him the way you look at something you're deciding what to do with. "Sit down," he said. The man sat. Zuri watched this from where she stood. She was still holding the jacket over her shoulders with both hands at the collar, and she was aware of how she looked. Aware in the way she was always aware of how she looked in rooms like this. The hypervigilance of a woman who has learned that awareness is a form of protection. But the awareness felt different now. Less like bracing and more like witnessing. One of the suited men had moved to the restaurant entrance and was speaking quietly into a phone. Another had positioned himself near Mira's table, not touching anything, not threatening anything, simply present in the way that presence can be its own form of pressure. The manager found his voice. It was thinner than before. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand the situation. You will." The man in the white shirt turned toward him with the same unhurried patience he'd used on everything else. "What's your name?" The manager blinked. "Park. Park Jin-yun." "Mr. Park." A pause. "How long have you managed this restaurant?" 7 years. 7 years. He repeated it without inflection. "And in 7 years, has it been your policy to ask assault victims to pay for the experience?" The word assault landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Zuri felt the ripple of it reach her. Park's composure cracked slightly at the surface. "That's not... I don't believe that characterizes what the cameras," the man said, "will characterize it when the footage is reviewed by the appropriate authorities tomorrow morning." He let that sit for a moment. "Unless you'd like to revise your characterization right now." Park's mouth opened and closed. He looked, Zuri thought, like a man who had spent 7 years being very good at managing situations for wealthy clients and had just encountered a situation that had reclassified itself beyond his expertise. Park started. "I'd think carefully," the man said, not unkindly. It was worse for not being unkind. Across the room, the man who had humiliated Zuri was watching all of this with the expression of someone reassessing a social situation too late to do anything useful about it. He was leaning slightly forward in his chair, elbows on knees, jaw working like he was chewing through possible responses and finding them all inadequate. His name, Zuri had learned from Mira's initial pitch, was Hyun Daesik, import business, socialite adjacent. The kind of man who existed at the edges of wealth and performed the center of it. He cleared his throat. "I don't know who you are," he said toward the man in the white shirt, and his voice had the specific quality of bravado that only appears when bravado is no longer warranted. "But this is a private dinner and you have no right to... Cassian." One of the suited men said it, just the name, flat and brief, from somewhere to the left, the way you might say a word to stop someone from touching something hot. Hyun Daesik stopped. The name moved through the room differently than anything else had. Zuri watched it travel, watched the socialite at the table nearest to her touch her companion's wrist, watched the gray-haired man in the expensive suit set down his wine glass with excessive care, watched Mira, 2 tables over, go very still in a way that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with the kind of fear that isn't dramatic but is total. Zuri looked at the man in the white shirt, Cassian. He hadn't reacted to his own name being said, hadn't turned toward the sound of it. He was still watching Hyun Daesik with the same patient attention, and Hyun Dae-sik was no longer speaking. "You wanted to say something," Cassian said to him. Hyun Dae-sik's jaw tightened. You were simply speaking loudly in a restaurant," Cassian said. "Earlier. About this woman." He didn't gesture toward Zuri, didn't redirect anyone's attention. His eyes stayed on Hyun Dae-sik. "I heard the recording on the way here. My associate was kind enough to pull it up." A pause. "I listened to it twice." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. "You mentioned her skin," Cassian continued. His voice hadn't changed in volume or temperature. If anything, it had gotten quieter, which was worse. "Her body, her worthiness of your company." He tilted his head slightly. "You threw money on the floor." "I didn't throw. I watched the video," Cassian said. Simply, flatly. The way you say something when the discussion of whether it happened is over. Hyun Dae-sik looked down at the table. It was then that Mira stood up. Zuri didn't expect it. She'd been watching Cassian and monitoring Hyun Dae-sik and keeping one eye on the manager's deteriorating composure, and she hadn't been watching Mira closely enough, which was a mistake she recognized as familiar. She'd made it before, trusting the familiar shape of someone while missing what was moving underneath. Mira was on her feet, and her face had gone through several things in rapid succession and landed on something that looked like defiance but had the texture of desperation. She was still holding her phone, screen down now, but her knuckles were white around it. "This is insane," Mira said. Her voice was too loud for the room's current temperature. "You don't know what happened here. You don't know the context. Mira!" Zuri said her name before she'd decided to. Mira's eyes snapped to her. And there it was. The thing Zuri had been too charitable to see during 2 years of shared lunches and borrowed pencils. Not jealousy exactly, though that was part of it. Something more corrosive. The specific bitterness of a person who believed they deserved something and watched someone they considered lesser receive it instead, and had been storing that bitterness so long and so carefully that it had become structural, had become load-bearing, had become the thing holding the rest of their personality together. "You won because they felt sorry for you," Mira said. She wasn't performing now. The cameras were down, and she was saying the things she'd actually meant. The scholarship, the internship offer, you know that, right? You know that's why they picked you. Zuri felt the words land. She'd be dishonest if she said she hadn't heard versions of this before, hadn't heard it in her own head on her worst nights. The voice that sounds like truth because it's fluent in your specific fears. But she'd also spent 11 days on a dress that was currently being admired from a distance by people who had been mocking its creator 30 minutes ago, and she'd spent 2 years of late nights and skipped meals building a body of work that the faculty had called, she'd read the written evaluation 4 times, extraordinary. "They picked me," Zuri said, "because my work was better." It came out without anger, which surprised her, just a statement, a fact she'd decided to inhabit. Mira's expression fractured. "You think a black plus-size woman in Korean fashion is going to be taken seriously? I was doing you a favor by showing you now, before you embarrass yourself somewhere that actually—" "Stop," Cassian said at once. Mira stopped. He turned toward her fully for the first time since entering the restaurant, and whatever Mira found in his expression made her take a small, involuntary step back. Her heel caught the leg of her chair. She grabbed the table to steady herself. "You arranged tonight," Cassian said. Not a question. Mira's chin came up. "I don't have to, You arranged it," he said again, with the patience of someone who doesn't need confirmation because they already have it and are simply providing her the opportunity to be honest before circumstances force her to be. "You contacted Hyun Dae-sik. You set the reservation. You chose the date." Mira's mouth worked. "You were jealous of her sets," he said. "You planned this to humiliate her publicly and damage her reputation before she could establish it." He paused. "Your father is Im Sung-cheol." The name hit Mira like a physical thing. Her face went the particular white of someone whose blood has redirected itself towards something urgent. "That's," she started. "Import licensing violations," Cassian said. 3 separate investigations, all of which have been ongoing for some time. He looked at her without expression. "All of which, as of this morning, have been given additional documentation by parties who were previously unwilling to cooperate. The room was so quiet, Zuri could hear the ice settling in a glass somewhere behind her. Mira sat back down. She didn't choose to. Her legs made the decision without consulting her. Cassian looked at the room at large then. A slow sweep, unhurried, taking in every table, every face, every person who had held a phone or thrown a bill or laughed at the right moment. He let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, then let it stretch further, past uncomfortable, into the territory where people start to understand that comfort is not the goal. This woman, he said, and this time he did indicate Zuri, a brief, deliberate gesture, came to this restaurant tonight in good faith. Nobody moved. She was invited under false pretenses, publicly degraded, filmed without consent, and then told to pay compensation for the experience. He looked at the manager, who appeared to have stopped breathing voluntarily several minutes ago. The footage is already with my attorneys. The health and safety records of this establishment have been requested. He let that land. The building's ownership documents have also been reviewed. Another pause. We found some things. Park Jin-hyun went gray. Hyun Dae-sik had the look of a man running calculations and finding every answer negative. He'd been sitting very still since Cassian had last addressed him, and the stillness had a quality to it, a concentrated stillness, like a man counting exits. I want to leave, Hyun Dae-sik said, quietly, to the table. You'll leave when she does, Cassian said. Not before. Hyun Dae-sik's head came up. His mouth pressed into a line. Whatever argument he was constructing behind his eyes, he thought better of it. He looked back down at the table. Zuri stood in the middle of all of this with the jacket still over her shoulders and tried to locate what she was feeling. It wasn't relief exactly. Relief would come later, maybe, in a room by herself when she could process the evening without an audience. Right now, what she felt was something rawer and harder to name. The disorienting sensation of being seen clearly after being deliberately obscured, like adjusting to light after a very long time in the dark. She looked at Cassian. He had moved to stand a few feet from her, close enough to speak quietly, far enough that she wasn't enclosed. She noticed that. The distance he'd calibrated, the space he'd preserved. You're not a businessman, she said. No, he said. Who are you? He looked at her for a moment. Something passed across his face that she couldn't fully read. Not evasion exactly, but the expression of a man deciding how much of the truth to give. Not because he wanted to deceive her, but because the whole truth was a long conversation that this room was not the right place for. Cassian Varga, he said. She waited for more. That's enough for now, he said. It should have felt dismissive. It didn't. It felt strangely honest. The acknowledgement that there was more and the admission that now wasn't the time, and the trust placed in her to understand the difference. Behind her, she heard Hyun Dae-sik shift in his chair, heard the deliberate scrape of it against the stone floor, the beginning of a movement. One of the suited men was at the table in 3 steps. He didn't touch Hyun Dae-sik. He simply stood beside the chair, and the movement stopped. I said, Cassian repeated without turning around, when she does. Hyun Dae-sik exhaled through his nose, stayed seated. The influencer who'd been filming from the far table, a man in his late 20s Zuri recognized vaguely from someone's Instagram feed. The kind of face that existed primarily in curated light, raised his hand slightly, the way you raise your hand when you're not sure you have permission to speak, but need to try. My sponsors, he started, withdrew this evening, one of Cassian's men said, from somewhere to the left. Without looking up from a phone he was scrolling through. All 4. The influencer's hand went back to the table. His face did something complicated and then went blank, which was worse. Zuri watched all of this and felt the strange, nauseating vertigo of a night that had been one thing and was now, rapidly, becoming something else entirely. She'd walked in expecting dinner. She'd been turned into a spectacle. And now the spectacle had been interrupted by something she didn't have a category for yet. Not rescue exactly, because she'd been standing on her own 2 feet and hadn't fallen, but something adjacent to it, something that felt less like being saved and more like being witnessed by someone who refused to look away. She was still trying to locate herself in the rearranged geometry of the evening when Cassian turned to face her again. and said something she wasn't prepared for. "I've been looking for you," he said, "for 4 months." She stared at him. "My sister," he said. October. Outside Hongik University. There was a man, and she was alone, and she wasn't... He stopped, reworked what he was about to say. "You were there." October. The memory surfaced slowly, then all at once, the way certain things do. A cold night outside the university library. A girl she didn't know in a situation that had required Zuri to put herself between the girl and a man who was much larger than either of them, to make noise, to be unmovable even when unmovable was not a comfortable thing to be. Until other people arrived and the man left, and the girl had grabbed Zuri's hand and said thank you in a voice that was still shaking. Zuri had never learned the girl's name, had never thought about it afterward as anything other than a Tuesday night that required a particular kind of courage, and then it was over, and she went home and ate ramen and went to bed. "That was your sister," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "She's all right?" Something in his face shifted then. Not much, but enough. "She is," he said. "Because of you." Zuri let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It came out ragged and sideways, and she turned her face slightly away for a second, gathering the pieces of herself back together. When she turned back, the restaurant was still frozen around them. Every person who had laughed or filmed or thrown money was sitting exactly where Cassian's presence had placed them, and the room felt like the moment before something irrevocable, the held breath before a fall. Cassian looked at her steadily. There was something in his expression that was almost, not quite, but almost asking permission. "There are things that need to happen next," he said, "things that concern everyone in this room tonight." His eyes moved briefly across the space. "I can handle them, without you. You can leave now, and I will make certain this is not left unfinished." Zuri looked at him, looked at the room, at Mira, who had gone small and pale at her table, at Hyun Dae-sik, still studying the white linen in front of him like it contained instructions, at the manager, who was standing against the wall with the posture of a man waiting for a verdict, at the money still on the floor. Her money. Not money she'd accepted, money that had been thrown at her feet like she was something to be pitied or purchased, and it was still lying there on the stone because she had refused to gather it, and nobody else had touched it because touching it meant acknowledging what it was. She looked back at Cassian. "I'm not leaving," she said. Something in him settled. It was subtle, a shift in the set of his shoulders, a fraction of an adjustment in his posture, but she caught it. "All right," he said. He turned back to the room, and outside, through the tall glass windows of Soir restaurant, the first of 3 black vehicles had pulled up to the curb, and 2 more men in dark suits were stepping out onto the February pavement, and the night, which had already been so many things, was about to become something that none of the people in that room would ever fully recover from, because what Cassian Varga was about to do to their carefully constructed lives had not started tonight and was not going to end here. And every single one of them was only now beginning to understand that the woman in the emerald dress had not arrived at this restaurant. The 3 black vehicles sat at the curb with their engines off and their headlights cutting pale rectangles into the February dark. And the men who had stepped out of them were now inside the restaurant, and the restaurant had become something that no longer resembled itself. Cassian Varga stood in the center of it and began to dismantle people's lives with the same unhurried efficiency with which another man might sort mail. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke to his associates in brief, clipped exchanges that Zuri could only partially hear from where she'd positioned herself. Not behind him, not beside him exactly, but slightly to his left, at an angle that gave her a clear line of sight to Mira's table and to Hyun Dae-sik's chair and to the manager, Park Jin-hyun, who had located a wall and appeared to be attempting to merge with it. She had not sat down. Sitting felt like surrender, and she had already given this room enough. The first thing Cassian's people did was collect the phones. Not by force, by the particular species of request that functions as a command, because everyone in the room understood what happened if you treated it as optional. A man with a broad jaw and a suit that fit him like a warning moved from table to table, and people placed their devices face down on the linen without being touched, without being threatened, with the resigned compliance of passengers on a delayed flight who have stopped pretending they have other options. The influencer. His name was apparently Gyeon Seojun. One of Cassian's associates had confirmed this from his own phone with the casual speed of someone pulling up a grocery list, sat with both hands flat on his table, and watched his phone slide away from him with an expression Zuri recognized. She'd worn a version of it herself, earlier in the evening, when she'd understood for the first time that she was in the center of something she hadn't consented to. That particular look of a person registering, in real time, that the story they thought they were in has reclassified itself around them. She didn't feel sorry for him. She registered his expression clinically, the way you register weather through glass. Cassian moved toward Hyun Dae-sik's table. Hyun Dae-sik had been sitting with a forced composure that had steadily degraded over the past 20 minutes from executive stillness to something that looked increasingly like a man trying not to visibly sweat in a room where sweating was evidence. His suit was still perfect. His hair was still arranged. But the space between his eyes had developed a crease that hadn't been there when Zuri walked in, and his hands, which were wrapped around a water glass he hadn't drunk from, were pressed together too hard. Cassian pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. It was the first time he'd sat all evening. The gesture made it worse, somehow. More intimate. More final. "Hyun Dae-sik," Cassian said. Not loud, just clear. "I want my attorney present," Hyun Dae-sik said. His voice had the brittle quality of something that had been solid an hour ago. "You're not under arrest," Cassian said. I'm not the police." "Then I don't have to." "You don't have to do anything," Cassian agreed. "You've been establishing that all evening." He set one hand flat on the table between them. "I want to talk about the Yunshin account." Whatever Hyun Dae-sik had been bracing for, it wasn't that. The crease between his eyes deepened, and then his face did something more complicated. A series of micro-adjustments that Zuri, watching from her position 8 feet away, cataloged as the face of a man encountering a threat that arrived from a direction he hadn't been guarding. "That has nothing to do with— It has everything to do with tonight," Cassian said. "Because tonight tells me what kind of man you are in public, and I already knew what kind of man you are in private." He paused. 17 million won, offshore, rerouted through 3 holding companies, 2 of which dissolved before the fiscal year closed. He looked at Hyun Dae-sik without blinking. The 3rd didn't dissolve fast enough. Hyun Dae-sik set the water glass down. His hands went to his lap. "Where did you—" "I have thorough friends," Cassian said. Across the restaurant, Mira had been listening to this with the posture of someone trying to take up no space at all. She'd pulled her arms in and crossed them over her chest and made herself smaller in increments, chair by chair, as though she could reclassify herself as furniture if she compressed sufficiently. The women she'd come with had been escorted to a separate table by one of Cassian's men 20 minutes ago and had not been part of any conversation since, existing in a state of marble-faced suspension that was probably the best decision they'd made all evening. But Mira was not marble-faced. Mira was cycling through expressions with the frantic energy of a person whose internal narrative was being revised faster than she could keep up with, and Zuri recognized in her face something she had not expected to find. Fear that had nothing to do with Cassian. Mira was afraid of something specific. Zuri had been watching her for 2 years across lunches and studio critiques and the particular social ecosystem of a design program where everyone was competing for the same small pool of recognition, and she knew Mira's expressions with the involuntary fluency of proximity. The expression on Mira's face right now was not the fear of consequences from outside. It was the fear of something being found that she had buried and believed was deep enough. One of Cassian's associates, a younger man, lean, with a tablet he'd produced from somewhere and been scrolling through for the past several minutes, crossed the room and leaned down to speak quietly near Cassian's ear. Cassian listened. His face didn't change. He thanked the man with a slight nod, and the man withdrew. Then Cassian looked at Mira, just looked at her from across the restaurant, for long enough that Mira's arms tightened across her chest and her chin went down slightly. "Come here," Cassian said. Mira didn't move immediately. She did the thing people do when they're calculating whether compliance is safer than resistance and landing, reluctantly, on compliance. She stood up, pushing back from the table with a scrape, and crossed the restaurant floor with the stiff, deliberate walk of someone controlling every step, because losing control of a single one felt catastrophic. She stopped at the edge of Hyun Dae-sik's table. She didn't look at Zuri. "Sit," Cassian said. She sat in the chair adjacent to Hyun Dae-sik. He moved slightly away from her without appearing to. Two people who had conspired in the same direction now sitting 6 inches apart and treating those 6 inches like a verdict. Cassian looked at both of them. Then he said something that Zuri hadn't expected. "Tell her why." Mira's head came up. "What?" "Not me," Cassian said. "Her." He indicated Zuri without turning. "Tell her why." The silence that followed had a particular texture. Mira's jaw worked. Her eyes went to Zuri, and then away, and then back, caught there, unable to decide which direction was less exposed. "Mira," Zuri said. Her voice was quiet. Not gentle, not cold. Quiet in the way that a room is quiet when it's been emptied of everything except the essential thing. Mira's throat moved. "You weren't supposed to win," she said. It came out smaller than she'd intended. "The competition, the Choi internship. I've been working toward that since first year. My portfolio, my contacts. I built everything around that one opportunity." She stopped. "And then you just walked in your second year with a collection that wasn't even—" "Say the rest," Zuri said. Mira's mouth compressed. "It wasn't supposed to go to you," she said, and there was the truth of it, unmedicated, sitting in the air between them without the wrapping of context or justification. Not that Zuri's work wasn't good, not even that Mira's was better. Simply that in the story Mira had been constructing for 2 years, the outcome had been assigned, and Zuri had disrupted the assignment by existing more capably than the story allowed for. Zuri looked at her for a long moment. "And this was your solution," she said. "Make me small enough that it made sense." Mira didn't answer. The answer was on her face. Cassian had been watching this exchange without intervening, and now he nodded almost imperceptibly, as though something had been confirmed that he'd already measured. He looked at his associate with the tablet and said 2 words quietly. The associate typed something. Then Park Jin-hyun, the manager, stepped away from his wall. He did it with the halting movement of a man who had been composing a speech for the past 20 minutes and had decided that delivering it was preferable to waiting for whatever was coming to him. "Mr. Varga," he said. His voice had recovered some of its professional register, though the seams showed. "I understand that this evening that the situation was handled poorly. I want to be clear that this restaurant's official position is one of deep regret for any—" "Mr. Park," Cassian said without looking at him, "your restaurant's health code violations going back to 2021 have been forwarded to the district office. Your business license renewal, which was due last month, appears to have been processed with documentation your filing agent has agreed in the past hour was inaccurate." Park's speech collapsed. "Additionally," Cassian continued, "the building you've operated in for 7 years was purchased this morning by an LLC registered in my associate's name." He paused. "Your lease renewal meeting is at 9 tomorrow. I'd suggest attending." Park stood very still for a moment. Then he did something unexpected. He turned toward Zuri, and on his face was an expression that was attempting sincerity, with the unpracticed difficulty of a man who had spent 7 years in an industry that valued performance over substance. It wasn't convincing. But it was, Zuri thought, possibly real. "Miss," he said, "I owe you an apology that I am not equipped to give adequately tonight." "No," Zuri said, "you're not." He nodded. Went back to his wall. It was at the exact moment that the restaurant had achieved a kind of terrible equilibrium. Everyone in their designated position of consequence, the air thick with the specific gravity of accountability descending. That the door opened. Not the main entrance. The service entrance, at the back of the restaurant, the staff door that led from the kitchen corridor, which Zuri had clocked earlier in the evening with the automatic spatial awareness she'd developed from years of being in rooms where knowing the exits was survival instinct. A woman came through it. She was in her late 50s, well-dressed in the expensively understated way that distinguishes inherited wealth from acquired wealth, with silver-streaked hair cut close to her jaw and a posture that had been trained into the bone. She had not come through the service entrance by accident. She'd come through it because she'd known the front door would be watched. One of Cassian's men moved immediately. The woman raised one hand, a single, economical gesture, and the man stopped. Not because her gesture had authority over him, but because Cassian, who had turned the moment the service door opened, said let her through, in a voice that had changed. Not in volume, in temperature. Zuri turned to look at him and saw something on his face she hadn't seen all evening. Something that disrupted the controlled surface of him in a way that Hyun Dae-sik's bluster and Park's calculated contrition and Mira's unraveling had not managed to do. He knew this woman, and knowing her had cost him something. The woman walked across the restaurant with the measured pace of someone who had decided on her approach before she arrived and was not going to deviate from it. She stopped at the edge of the space Cassian occupied and looked at him with an expression that was, Zuri cataloged it without fully understanding it, not hostile, not warm either. Something in between that was more unsettling than either. "You're making a scene," the woman said to Cassian. "There was already a scene," he said. "I'm making an accounting." The woman's eyes moved to Zuri, assessed her with a directness that wasn't cruel but wasn't soft either, then moved back to Cassian. "Your father is aware you're here," she said. Something tightened in Cassian's face, barely visible. Zuri caught it because she'd been watching him for an hour and had learned the small vocabulary of his control. "My father," he said, "is not relevant. He'll disagree. He'll be wrong." The woman looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has been having a version of this argument for years and has stopped expecting to win it, but hasn't stopped having it. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and produced an envelope, which she held toward him. He didn't take it immediately. "What is this?" he said. "A conversation he didn't want to have in person," she said. Cassian took the envelope. He didn't open it. He held it at his side, and Zuri watched his hand, the one holding it, and saw the slight change in the way his fingers wrapped around the paper, not tighter, but differently, as though the weight had reclassified itself. "Who are you?" Zuri asked. The woman looked at her. There was a pause in which she appeared to be deciding something. "My name is Hana Varga," she said. "I'm Cassian's aunt." Zuri processed this. "I came," Hana Varga continued, still looking at Zuri with that flat, assessing directness, "because my brother asked me to deliver that letter, and because I wanted to see for myself." She paused. "The girl Cassian has been looking for." "I'm not a girl," Zuri said. Something that might have been approval crossed Hana's face and disappeared before it fully arrived. "No," she said. "You're not." Cassian had opened the envelope. He read whatever was inside with his face turned slightly away from the room, and Zuri watched his shoulders and saw the moment the letter reached whatever it contained that mattered, because something changed in the set of them. Not a collapse, not a flinch, but a settling of a different kind. The kind that looks like stillness and functions like the instant before a decision. He folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope in his trouser pocket. He stood like that for 3 or 4 seconds with his back to the room, and nobody spoke, which told Zuri something about how well everyone present understood the geography of his moods. Then he turned around, and his face was exactly as it had been, controlled, patient, giving nothing away. But his eyes had changed in a way that she couldn't name and couldn't shake. Something had moved into them that hadn't been there before, something with the quality of a door that has been locked from the inside. "There's a problem," he said to no one in particular. Hana Varga's expression said she agreed with this assessment. "The recordings," Cassian said. He looked at his associate with the tablet. "The ones from tonight." The associate's jaw tightened slightly. 3 were transferred before collection, he said. 2 to cloud storage. 1 to a third-party account we haven't identified. The room shifted. Even the people who didn't fully understand what was being discussed understood the register of the shift, the particular quality of a problem surfacing that had been submerged and is now taking up air. Zuri understood it faster than most of them. She was a woman who'd spent her entire adult life understanding what it meant for images of her to exist in places she hadn't authorized. "Which recordings?" she said. The associate looked at Cassian. "The ones from when you arrived," Cassian said. He looked at her directly. "Before I came in. The floor recordings, the money on the floor, Zuri crouching, Zuri's face in the candlelight, stripped and unguarded, doing the involuntary things faces do when they've been through something that exceeds their preparation. Those recordings, already somewhere beyond the room, already moving through channels she couldn't trace, already in the process of becoming permanent in the specific, irreversible way that the internet makes things permanent. She felt something cold move through her chest. "Who has them?" she said. The associate looked at his tablet. "The cloud transfers went to accounts registered to—" He stopped, looked at Cassian rather than continuing. "Say it," Cassian said. "One account registered to a media outlet. Gossip column, mid-tier, posts 3 times daily." He paused. "The other to a personal account." He looked up. "Registered to Im Sung-cheol, Mira's father." The name fell into the room, and Zuri watched Mira's face absorb it and go through 3 distinct stages in rapid sequence. The stage where you don't understand what you're hearing, the stage where you understand it and refuse it, and the stage where you understand it and can no longer refuse it and have to sit inside the understanding without anywhere to put it. "My father," Mira said. Flat, not a question. Nobody answered her. "My father has—" She stopped, started again. "He wasn't— I didn't tell him to—" Her voice fractured on the last word and she pressed her lips together hard, recovering it. "I didn't know he was going to be watching tonight." "He wasn't watching," the associate said. His voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't careful either. He was informed. Someone in this restaurant sent him footage in real time. Everyone in the room became very still. Mira's head turned. Slowly, with the mechanical quality of something being moved against its will, her gaze traveled to the table where her friends had been relocated. 3 women. One of them had her hands folded precisely on the table and was looking at the center of it with a focus that was too total, the focus of a person refusing to look up because looking up would be confirmation. "Sujin," Mira said. The woman with the folded hands looked up. Her face was composed in a way that had been prepared rather than arrived at. "You told him," Mira said. Sujin said nothing. "You were sending him—" Mira pushed back from her chair. One of Cassian's men stepped closer, but Cassian raised a hand slightly, and the man held. "You sent my father footage of—" She stopped. Her voice had lost its shape entirely. "Why?" "He asked me to keep him informed," Sujin said. Her voice was careful and unbothered in a way that was its own answer. "He asked you to keep—" Mira's hands came up to her face and then dropped again. She turned away from the table. The composure she'd been wearing like a coat she'd managed to keep on through everything the evening had thrown at her finally gave way, not dramatically. No tears, no collapse, but in the subtler, more complete way of someone whose self-narrative has been punctured and is deflating from the inside. "What does he want with—" "Leverage," Cassian said. Mira turned toward him. "Your father," Cassian said, "has been building a case against mine for 11 months. This," he indicated the restaurant, the evening, the ruin of it, "was not only your plan. It was accelerated by him, made more public by him. He needed footage of something damaging." He paused. He got footage of his daughter being involved in a public humiliation of a woman connected to me. Mira's face went through something that was almost impossible to watch, the understanding arriving in stages too fast to process, each one overriding the last, that her father had known, had used her plan, had amplified it, had positioned her in the center of something she'd started but hadn't controlled, had made her both instrument and exposure. "He used me," Mira said, and then quieter, more devastated. "He used me against you." "He used both of you," Hannah Varga said from where she'd remained at the edge of the space, watching all of this with the equanimity of a woman who has survived a long time in complicated proximity to power by being more accurate than everyone else in the room. That's what the letter says. She looked at Cassian. Your father wants you to walk away from this tonight, from all of it. Leave it unfinished. She paused. In exchange, Seoul doesn't publish the footage he has. What footage? Cassian said. His voice had gone very flat. Hana looked at him for a moment. The look of someone delivering information they would have preferred not to carry. From October, she said, outside Hongik University. The air in the room changed in a way that Zuri felt physically, in her sternum, before she'd processed what the words meant. October. Outside Hongik University. She looked at Cassian and watched his face do the one thing it had not done all evening. Go completely still in the way that is not control, but shock. The stillness of a man who has had the ground reclassified under him and hasn't yet decided how to stand on the new surface. The night Zuri had intervened. The night she'd put herself between a man and a girl she didn't know. The night she'd made noise and been unmovable, and the girl had grabbed her hand and said thank you in a shaking voice. There had been a camera, somewhere. There had been footage the whole time, and she hadn't known it, and neither, she realized now from the expression currently living on Cassian Varga's face, had he. What's on it? She said. She was asking Hana, but she was watching Cassian. Hana Varga looked at her, then at Cassian. The kind of look that passes information through the air between two people who know something a third person doesn't yet. It shows my niece, Hana said carefully, being helped. Another pause. And it shows who was there before you arrived. Zuri's mind worked through this. Before she arrived. Someone was there before her. Someone who had not helped. Someone whose presence on that footage, in that context, on a night that had involved Cassian Varga's sister, and a man who should not have been there. Someone whose presence, if published, would not be a minor embarrassment, but something with a very different and more permanent set of consequences. She looked at Cassian. His jaw was set so hard she could see the muscle working at the corner of it. Who was there? She said. He didn't answer immediately. She watched him make the decision about whether to watch the calculation happen behind his eyes, the assessment of what telling her would cost against what not telling her would mean, and she saw the moment it resolved, and what it resolved into was something that looked very much like a man who had spent years keeping people at a distance for their own protection, arriving at the knowledge that distance was no longer available as a strategy. My father was there, Cassian said, and that was when Zuri understood, with a cold and complete clarity, that the evening had not been about her at all, that she had walked into a restaurant as a target and become, without anyone's permission, including her own, a piece in a game between two families whose history reached back further than anything that had happened in this room tonight, and that the woman in the emerald dress was not the prey in this story, or even the witness, but something both more powerful and more dangerous than either, because Seoul had footage of Cassian Varga's father abandoning his own granddaughter on a dark street in October, and the only other person on that footage who had done anything worth recording. The word hung in the air between them, father, and Zuri watched it do its work on the room the way a stone does its work on still water, the rings expanding outward, reaching every surface. Hana Varga had gone very quiet in the way that people go quiet when they've delivered something irreversible, and are now standing on the other side of it, waiting to see what shape the damage takes. One of Cassian's men had moved slightly toward the door, not fleeing, repositioning, the unconscious adjustment of a person whose training kicks in before his thoughts do. Even Hyun Daishik, who had spent the last hour trying to make himself as small and unremarkable as possible, had looked up from the table. Mira was staring at Cassian with her arms still crossed and her face doing something complicated, the expression of a person who has been betrayed by her own father and is trying to decide whether the betrayal is worse than the thing she did herself, running the moral arithmetic and finding it doesn't come out clean on either side. Cassian hadn't moved. He was standing exactly where he'd been standing when the letter arrived, and his posture was the same, shoulders level, hands at his sides, weight distributed with the trained evenness of a man who had learned long ago that visible tension is a form of information he couldn't afford to give away. But his face had changed, not dramatically, not in any way that someone who hadn't spent the past hour learning his expressions would have caught. But Zuri caught it. The specific quality of a man standing at the edge of a decision that has no good side. "Your father was there," she said again, not pressing, just placing it in the air between them so it couldn't be retracted. "Yes," Cassian said. "Before me." "Yes." "And he didn't—" "No," he said. The word came out clipped, severed at the root, and she stopped asking because the answer was already in the way he'd said it, and she didn't need it to be longer to understand what it meant. His father had been there. His sister had been in danger. His father had not intervened. And Zuri, 24 years old, a design student from a foreign country, a woman with no power and no stake, and no reason beyond the basic human reflex of recognizing a situation that required a body to put itself in the way, had done the thing his father had not. That was what was on the footage, and Im Sung-cheol had it. Cassian turned toward Hana. The movement was controlled in the way that all of his movements were controlled, but there was something underneath the control that Zuri could feel from where she stood, something pressurized. "How long has he had it?" Cassian said. "Long enough," Hana said. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." Hana met his gaze without flinching. She was the kind of woman, Zuri thought, who had been in rooms like this before. Not this specific room, not this specific species of crisis, but rooms where the temperature was wrong and the stakes were real and flinching was a form of defeat. "Your father asked me to come because he knew you wouldn't take his call. He wants you to leave the restaurant, drop everything you've started tonight. In return, Im holds the footage." "Holds it," Cassian said, "not destroys it." Hana said nothing. "He holds it," Cassian said, and his voice had gone to something Zuri hadn't heard from him before. Not louder, but lower, with a texture in it like stone under water. "And he uses it whenever I do something he doesn't approve of. It becomes a leash." He paused. "My father wants to put a leash on me using footage of his own failure." The last word, failure, landed in the room like a physical thing, and for a moment everything that had been moving stopped. Then Cassian's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something passed across his face that was too fast and too complex to name. He let it ring twice more, then answered it, raising it to his ear, and said nothing. From where Zuri stood, she could hear the voice on the other end. Not words. The wall of sound was too far away for that, but the register of it. Male, older, speaking with the measured cadence of a man who is accustomed to not needing to raise his voice because the volume has always been beside the point. Cassian listened for approximately 20 seconds. Then he said, "No." Single syllable. No elaboration. The voice on the phone continued. "No," Cassian said again. More voice. "You were there," Cassian said. The three words came out with a quiet force that was the verbal equivalent of something being driven into the ground. "You were there, and you did nothing. And a stranger did what you wouldn't. Publish the footage. Publish all of it." A pause in which the voice on the other end said something shorter and faster. "If you publish it, I will bury every financial arrangement you've made in the past 10 years so deep that excavating it takes the rest of your life. And then I will stand in front of every person in the city who respects you and tell them exactly what was on that footage in October." He paused. "Do the math." He pulled the phone from his ear and ended the call. The restaurant held its breath. Then Gaeon Seo-jun, the influencer, the man with the reaction videos, and the 4 lost sponsorships who had been sitting so carefully and so quietly for so long that Zuri had almost stopped tracking him, stood up. It was such an unexpected movement that for a half second nobody reacted, the way you don't react to the unexpected thing until it's already in motion and your body has had time to catch up to the surprise. "I'm leaving," Seo-jun said. His voice had found a different register than it had possessed earlier in the evening. Not the performance register, the one he used for cameras and captions, but something rawer and more cornered. "Whatever this is, I'm leaving. I came here tonight for dinner, and I filmed something that was already happening, and I'm not You monetized it, Zuri said. He turned toward her. He'd been avoiding looking at her directly all evening, the way people avoid looking directly at things they know will require them to feel something uncomfortable. And now he was looking at her, and his face was doing the work that faces do when they're being forced to reckon with something they'd prefer to reclassify as someone else's responsibility. I filmed it, he said. I didn't start it. You had 40,000 people watching, she said. You narrated it. You used my face, and you used my body, and you used the worst moment of my night to run your numbers. She was not shouting. She was not shaking. She'd been through enough in the past 2 hours that shaking was a resource she was conserving. You profited from it. Seojun's jaw tightened. That's not... Sit down, Cassian said. Seojun turned toward him with something in his expression that was trying to be defiance and landing closer to calculation. He was young enough to still believe that defiance could be performed without consequence if you timed it right. He looked at Cassian. He looked at the two men standing nearest to him. He sat down. It was in the moment after that the second unexpected thing happened, and this one was worse. Mira stood up, not with the hesitation of someone asking permission. She stood with the decisive abruptness of a person who has made a decision while everyone's attention was elsewhere and is now committed to it regardless of outcome. I need to call my father, she said. No, said two people simultaneously, Cassian and Hana, from different sides of the room, at the same instant, with the synchronicity of people who know the same thing. Mira's hand was already in her jacket pocket, reaching for a phone she'd apparently kept. A second phone, smaller, a model Zuri didn't recognize, which meant it hadn't been the one collected earlier. One of Cassian's men moved. He was fast. But Mira had the phone already open and had already pressed something before his hand closed around her wrist, and the question of what had been sent and to whom sat in the air above the table like smoke. Who did you contact? Cassian said. He was across the room in seconds and standing in front of her with a speed that was at odds with the unhurried quality he'd maintained all evening, and up close, at this proximity, Zuri could see for the first time the specific quality of his anger. It wasn't hot, wasn't explosive, but it was present now in a way it hadn't been before, living behind his eyes with a pressure that the controlled surface was working harder to contain. Mira's wrist was still held by the associate. Her chin was up. I told him to stop, she said. I told my father to let it go. Her voice was shaking at the edges in a way she wasn't controlling anymore. Whatever he has on you, whatever he thinks he's going to do with it, I told him to let it go. That this is enough. The room processed this. Cassian looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that Mira's posture, which had been braced for one kind of response, began to recalibrate uncertainly toward the possibility that it was going to receive a different kind. And if he doesn't, Cassian said. Then he doesn't, Mira said. Her voice broke on the last word and she stabilized it by pressing her lips together for a second. But I'm not... She stopped, looked at Zuri, and did it the way she'd been avoiding doing it all evening, directly, without the buffer of performance or planning. I'm not doing this anymore. Zuri looked back at her and felt the complicated, exhausting weight of what it was to receive an apology from a person who had hurt you in the middle of the circumstances that produced the apology. The question of whether it was real, and the question of whether real was enough, and the question of what you were supposed to do with your body while you decided. She didn't answer Mira. Not yet. That was a conversation for a room without an audience. Cassian's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the efficiency of his attention. He turned to the associate with the tablet and said 3 words Zuri didn't catch, and the associate began typing rapidly. What happened? Hana said. She wasn't asking Cassian. She was looking at the associate. Seoul released the footage, the associate said. Both clips, 30 seconds ago, to 3 separate media channels simultaneously. The air went out of the room. Zuri's chest tightened. She knew which footage. She knew what was in it. Her, on the floor in the candlelight, gathering nothing, refusing to gather the money, face unguarded and exposed, and all the seconds before Cassian arrived that she had spent standing in the center of the room being reduced, all of it now moving through the city's media channels, with the speed and thoroughness of a thing that has been deliberately released rather than leaked. The October footage too? Cassian said. Not yet, the associate said. Not yet. 2 words that meant Im Sung-chul was still calculating. Had released the restaurant footage as a demonstration of capability. Was holding the October footage as leverage to see what the demonstration produced. Cassian turned away from the room, just for a moment, 2 or 3 seconds, facing the tall window beside the entrance, looking at the black vehicles at the curb and the February street beyond them. Zuri watched his reflection in the glass. His face, at this angle, in this light, was doing something she hadn't seen before. Something private and unguarded for those 2 or 3 seconds. The face of a man who has planned extremely carefully and is now standing in the gap between the plan and the thing the plan did not account for. Then he turned back. "Bring them in," he said. Hana looked at him sharply. "Cassian," I said, "bring them in." 2 of his men went through the main entrance. They were gone for less than 90 seconds. When they came back, there were 2 additional people with them, a man and a woman, both in their 40s, both with the appearance of people who had been summoned somewhere they hadn't expected to be summoned, and had come anyway because the alternative wasn't clearly better. The man was carrying a professional camera bag. The woman had a recorder, journalists. Zuri looked at Cassian. "You had press waiting outside," she said. "Since before I walked in," he said. "You were going to—" "I was going to give them a story," he said. "One that I controlled." He paused. "Im Sung-chul has given them a story instead, which means I no longer control the framing." He looked at her then, with something that was the closest thing to uncertainty she'd seen from him, and it was the most human thing about him, that look, and she understood instinctively that it was not something he showed often and not something he showed without cost. "The footage of you is going to be everywhere by morning," he said. "I can't stop it. What I can do is make certain it doesn't tell the story Im wants it to tell." He paused. "But that requires something from you." "What?" she said. "I need you to talk to them." She looked at the journalists. The woman with the recorder was watching her with a professional neutrality that Zuri had learned in various contexts over the years could go either direction. The man with the camera had the lens capped, the body language of someone waiting for permission rather than assuming it. "You want me to give a statement," she said. "I want you to tell what happened tonight," he said. "All of it. The invitation. The setup. What was said to you. What was done." He held her gaze. "Your words. Your framing, not mine." She felt the weight of it, not the weight of the request, that she understood, could see the logic of clearly, but the weight of what it would cost to do it, to sit in front of a camera or a recorder and give language to what had been done to her tonight was to claim it as a story she was the subject of. And there was a particular kind of violence in that, in being required to narrativize your own humiliation while the humiliation was still this fresh, the wound still this close to the surface. She looked at the journalists. She looked at Mira, who was sitting in her chair with her hands in her lap, and her second phone on the table in front of her and her face stripped down to something underneath the performance that Zuri hadn't seen before. Something that looked, improbably, like a person who had arrived at the ruins of her own plan and was beginning to understand the dimensions of what she'd built it on. She looked at Hyun Dae-sik, who had stopped performing composure entirely and was simply sitting, his expensive suit still perfect, and everything inside it significantly less so, a man waiting for a verdict he'd already written. She looked at the money on the floor. Still there. No one had touched it. The bills and coins that had been thrown at her feet lay scattered across the stone in the same rough pattern they'd landed in, and the candles had burned lower in the past 2 hours, and the light was warmer now, the way candlelight gets warmer as it gets closer to the end of itself. And in that light, the money on the floor looked less like an insult and more like evidence, which was exactly what it was. She turned to the journalist with the recorder. "My name is Zuri Bennett," she said. "I'm a second-year fashion design student. Tonight I was invited to this restaurant under false pretenses by a classmate who arranged a coordinated public humiliation using a man I'd never met, a live stream she ran herself, and a room full of people who chose to participate." She paused. Her voice was steady. She was choosing every word with the same care she chose fabric, for weight, for grain, for what it would do under stress. "I want to tell you exactly what happened, and I want to start with the money on the floor, because I think that's the image people are going to see tomorrow, and I want them to know what it means." The journalist raised the recorder. The camera cap came off. And at that exact moment, from somewhere outside, through the glass of the tall restaurant windows, From the direction of the three black vehicles at the curb came the sound of another car arriving. Not a black vehicle, a white one, moving fast, stopping hard, the specific sound of expensive brakes applied with intention. Cassian turned toward the window. Hana made a sound beside him, not a word, just a single syllable of involuntary response, and her hand went to her mouth in a gesture so uncharacteristic of everything Zuri had observed of her in the past hour that it froze the room more effectively than any command. The white car's door opened. An older man stepped out onto the February pavement. He was tall, still, silver-haired, wearing a coat that had been made for a different kind of evening than the one currently unfolding. He stood at the curb for a moment, looking at the restaurant's windows, and even from inside through the glass, with the candlelight and the camera and the recorder and the wreckage of the evening arranged around her, Zuri could see that he was looking specifically at Cassian. And Cassian was looking back at him with the face of a son, not the controlled, patient, authoritative face he'd worn all evening. The other one. The one underneath. The one that only exists in the specific, complicated space between a person and their history. "Your father is here," Hana said, quietly, as though it needed to be said, as though Cassian hadn't already seen. "I know," Cassian said. The older man reached back into the white car and produced something. An envelope, not unlike the one Hana had delivered, but larger, thicker, the kind that contains not a letter but a collection of things. And he held it against his chest as he walked toward the restaurant entrance, and one of Cassian's men at the door looked at Cassian for instruction, and Cassian stood very still for 3 full seconds in which everything in the room waited: the journalists, the broken people at their tables, the money on the floor, the recorder raised and live, the cameras and the February cold, and the 11 days of work on a green dress that was still the most beautiful thing in the room, and said, "Let him in." He walked through the door the way men walk through doors when they have decided that walking through the door is the last available move on a board they've been losing for longer than anyone in the room knows. Victor Varga was 63 years old and looked like what he was, a man who had built something very large over a very long time and had paid for the size of it in ways that didn't show on the outside but had reorganized everything within. The silver hair, the coat, the bearing, all of it said power in the language that certain rooms read fluently. But Zuri was watching his hands, and his hands said something different. The envelope pressed against his chest with both palms, the way you hold something you're not sure you should have brought, the way you carry an object that has reclassified itself between the moment you picked it up and the moment you arrived. He stopped inside the entrance. He looked at Cassian. Cassian looked back at him. The journalist with the recorder had lowered it instinctively when the door opened. The way you lower a tool when the situation it was built for has been temporarily suspended by a larger one. The camera stayed uncapped, but still. Everyone in the room had the quality of people watching something they understood was not for them. A private reckoning happening in a public space, which was, Zuri thought with the portion of her mind still running observations, precisely the same dynamic that had brought her here in the first place. "You came yourself," Cassian said. "Yes," Victor said. "I told you on the phone. I know what you told me." Victor's voice was the voice Zuri had heard through the phone earlier, measured, accustomed to authority, but with something in it now that hadn't been there then. A register she hadn't caught through the small speaker. Something that had the quality of a man who has been rehearsing a scene for months and arrived at the performance and discovered that the script is wrong. "I came because the phone was insufficient." He looked around the restaurant then, slowly, taking inventory the way his son had taken inventory when he'd first entered hours ago. The phones on tables, the people in their designated seats of consequence, Park Jin-hyun against the wall, Hyun Dae-sik studying the tablecloth, Mira with her hands in her lap and her second phone face up in front of her, Hana standing at the edge of the space with her arms at her sides. Hana. He did not look at for long. Whatever that relationship contained, it was complicated in ways the evening didn't have room for. Then his eyes found Zuri. He looked at her the way she'd been looked at all evening, and none of the ways. Not with the contempt of Hyun Dae-sik, not with the assessing precision of Cassian, not with the professional neutrality of the journalists. He looked at her with the expression she had least expected to find on the face of Victor Varga, which was recognition. The specific recognition of a man encountering someone he has thought about from a distance and is now standing in front of for the first time. "Miss Bennett," he said. She hadn't expected him to know her name. "October," she said. He held her gaze. "Yes. You were there." She said it the way Cassian had said things all evening, not as an accusation that needed decoration, just as a fact being placed in the shared air. "Before me." Victor's jaw moved. "Yes. Your granddaughter," she said. She still didn't know the girl's name. That detail, that absence felt suddenly important. That she had put herself in the way of harm for a girl whose name she'd never learned, and now the girl's grandfather was standing in front of her in a restaurant at midnight with an envelope pressed to his chest and an expression on his face that was doing the slow, difficult work of a man deciding to stop being something he's been for a very long time. "Her name is Seoul," Victor said, as though he'd heard the thought. Zuri absorbed this. Seoul, a name for a face she still remembered, young, terrified, then tearful, then the warm grip of fingers around her hand in the dark. "She's well," Victor said. "I know," Zuri said. "Cassian told me." Victor looked at his son then, a look that carried the full freight of whatever existed between them, which was clearly vast and clearly old and clearly not resolvable in this room on this evening, but which was, Zuri thought, at least no longer being avoided. "The footage," Cassian said. He hadn't moved from where he'd been standing when his father entered. "Im Sung-cheol released the restaurant clips 20 minutes ago. He's holding the October footage." "I know," Victor said. "You know." "He called me before he released anything." Victor looked at his son steadily. "He told me his terms. He wanted me to bring you something." He extended the envelope. Cassian didn't take it immediately. He looked at it the way he'd looked at the first envelope, the one Hana had brought, but differently. This look had more in it. The specific quality of a man who has spent a significant portion of his adult life refusing things from the person currently offering them, and is now calculating the cost of one more refusal against a board that has changed. "What's in it?" Cassian said. "Everything he has," Victor said. "Every copy of the October footage, every backup, documentation of where it was stored, and confirmation that the accounts have been deleted." He paused. "I authenticated it before I came. I had 2 separate people verify." "What did you give him?" Cassian said. Victor's expression didn't change, which was its own answer. "What did you give him?" Cassian said again, and this time there was something in his voice that was not anger, but was adjacent to it. The sound of a man who already knows and is giving his father one more chance to say it cleanly. "The Incheon arrangement," Victor said. "The Yunshin subsidiary. The documentation he needed to close the investigation into his licensing violations." He paused. "His lawyers have it. As of an hour ago, the 3 investigations into Im Sung-cheol's business were effectively neutralized." The room absorbed this. Mira made a sound, not a word. A sound. Small and involuntary. The kind that escapes before you've made the decision to let it. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. Her eyes were doing something she wasn't controlling. Her father. The investigations. The thing that had been threatening her family for months. The thing Cassian had cited as leverage, the thing she'd understood as the mechanism of her father's guilt, had just been resolved. Not by Mira's plan, not by anything she'd done tonight, by the man across the room handing his son an envelope as the price of protecting a secret that should never have existed. "You negotiated with him," Cassian said. "Yes," Victor said. "You protected him." "I protected the footage." "It's the same thing." Victor's jaw set. "It is not the same thing." "You cleaned up a criminal's record," Cassian said, and now the control was costing him visibly, the seams of it showing under the pressure of the evening and the late hour and the thing he was looking at, which was his father choosing the same calculation he'd been choosing for decades, protecting the larger structure at the expense of the smaller human thing. To prevent people from seeing footage of you failing to protect your own granddaughter. The word failing hit Victor the way nothing else in the room had hit anything all evening. Not the name dropping, not the financial disclosures, not the legal threats. This hit him in the place that was still soft, and Zuri watched it happen, watched the 63 years of constructed authority absorb the word and not quite manage to redistribute the impact. Yes, Victor said, quietly, without deflection. The yes was worse than any defense would have been. Cassian looked at his father for a long moment. Zuri could see the effort of the look, how much it was costing him to maintain it, to stay in it, to not look away from the thing that was actually there instead of the version of it he could manage. "Why did you come here?" Cassian said. "You could have sent her." He indicated Hana. "You could have sent anyone." "Because I needed to see her," Victor said. And he was looking at Zuri when he said it. The journalist with the recorder, Zuri realized, had raised it again. Quietly, without announcement, the red light of it on in the periphery of her vision. The camera had shifted slightly. She noticed and did not stop them, because what was happening in this room right now was a record that deserved to exist, and not on Im Sung Cheol's terms, or Victor Varga's terms, or anyone else's but its own. She looked at Victor. "Why?" she said. He crossed the restaurant. Not quickly, with the measured step of a man covering ground that he understands he should have covered long ago and is covering now under conditions he did not choose. He stopped in front of her, and up close he was taller than she'd registered from across the room, and older, the lines of his face deeper in the candlelight, the silver of his hair brighter. He held out the envelope. She took it. "Whatever is in there," he said, "belongs to you, not to me, not to my son." He paused. "You were in that street because you are who you are. I was in that street because I was calculating, and what I calculated—" He stopped. The sentence didn't have an ending that served him, and he didn't manufacture one. "Soa asked me to tell you her name," he said. "She has asked me that twice since October. I wasn't able to locate you until tonight." "Until your son did," Zuri said. "Yes," Victor said. "Until my son did." Cassian had moved during this, not toward his father, not away. He'd moved to the edge of the space near the windows, and he was standing with his back at 3/4 to the room, looking at the street outside, at the white car at the curb beside his black ones. His hands were in his pockets. His shoulders were level. He was doing the thing people do when they need to feel nothing for long enough to get through the next 5 minutes. Zuri opened the envelope. Inside were 2 hard drives, small and matte and unassuming, and a folded document that was clearly a legal certification of deletion, with the signatures and stamps of 3 separate data security firms. She held the drives in her palm and looked at them for a moment, at the specific weight of what they contained. Her own image, her own worst hour, the footage Im Sung Chol had planned to use as currency, and felt the strange, unglamorous sensation of reclaiming something that should never have been taken. She looked at the journalist with the recorder. "I'm going to finish my statement," she said, "and I'd like to add something." The journalist nodded. "What happened to me tonight in this restaurant was planned," Zuri said. "It was organized by someone who is jealous of my work, executed by someone who doesn't value women who look like me, amplified by people who turned cruelty into content, and protected by a manager who valued his customers' comfort over my safety." She paused. She was not reading from anything. She was speaking from somewhere that had been building pressure for 2 hours and had found, finally, a clean exit. But what happened to me tonight was also interrupted, and I want to be clear about who interrupted it and why. Because I think those 2 things are different stories and both of them are true. She looked at Cassian's back, at the line of his shoulders against the window. A man I'd never met walked into this room and put a jacket on my shoulders because I was cold, and because what he saw when he walked in was wrong, and he was unwilling to stand in the presence of it and do nothing. She paused. "That's not rescue. I was still standing. I hadn't fallen. But there is something between rescue and indifference, and that something matters, and I think we don't have a word for it that does it justice." Cassian had turned from the window. He was looking at her now. "I also want to say," Zuri continued, and here she looked at Mira, who was sitting with her eyes bright, and her face the face of someone who has been through a long night and arrived at the other side of it not intact but still present, that the person who organized tonight is someone I'm not going to describe as my enemy. She did something cruel. She did it out of something she's had in her for a long time that I'm not qualified to diagnose. But she also, at the end of the night, told her father to stop, which doesn't undo anything, which doesn't make any of this acceptable. She paused. But it matters that she said it. I'm not ready to say more than that yet. I might be later. Mira looked at the table. Zuri looked at Hyun Dae-sik. He had been so still for so long that he'd achieved a kind of invisibility, the way inanimate objects achieve invisibility by not requiring response. She looked at him now, and he felt the look and raised his head with the heaviness of a man who has run out of angles. You said things tonight, Zuri said, that you cannot unsay. You said them loudly, and you said them in front of cameras, and you said them with the confidence of someone who had never imagined being held accountable for them. She paused. I need you to understand that every word you said tonight is documentation, and I intend to use it. Hyun Dae-sik's throat moved. He opened his mouth. Don't apologize right now, she said. It would be for your benefit, not mine, and I'm not interested in what benefits you tonight. His mouth closed. She looked at Geon Seojun. He was watching her with his hands flat on the table and his face stripped of the performance register entirely, and what was underneath it was younger than she'd expected. Not young, he was in his late 20s, but younger in the sense of less formed, less arrived. The face of a person who had been performing an identity so long they'd begun to mistake the performance for the person. You're going to post a full retraction, she said. Not a clarification, not a context video, a retraction. You're going to name what you did and you're going to do it in the same format you used tonight, with the same reach, with the same audience. She paused. And then you're going to figure out what your platform is actually for, because it's clear you haven't decided yet. Sojun looked at her. Something moved across his face that she didn't expect and couldn't name. Not shame exactly, though that was in it, but something more specifically uncomfortable than shame. The discomfort of a person who has been told a truth they already knew and were hoping nobody else could see. Okay, he said. Just that. One word. It was somehow the most human thing anyone in the restaurant had said all evening. Zuri set the envelope carefully on the nearest table. She reached up and removed Cassian's jacket from her shoulders. She held it for a moment, feeling the quality of the fabric, the weight of it, the warmth it had retained from the past 2 hours of contact. Then she turned and crossed the restaurant and held it out toward him. He took it. His fingers briefly touched the back of her hand in the process, not intentionally, just the geometry of the exchange, and neither of them commented on it. The dress, he said quietly. Not a non sequitur. He was looking at it. The emerald silk, the seams she'd been most worried about, the hemline that had caught candlelight all evening. You made it. 11 days, she said. It's extraordinary, he said. She looked at him. He was not saying it the way people say things to people who need to hear them. He was saying it the way people say things that are simply true. I know, she said. Victor Varga had moved during this exchange to stand near Hana. The two of them occupied their corner of the room with the particular quality of siblings who have been through the same long history from different angles and have arrived tonight at a juncture that neither had expected. Hana had her arms crossed but loosely, not defensively. Victor had his hands at his sides, the envelope gone now, nothing left to hold. The Incheon arrangement, Cassian said to his father. He said it across the room, not loudly. What you gave Im to buy the footage. Victor looked at him. I want it back, Cassian said. Not immediately, not tonight. But I want it reconstructed, and I want Im Sung-cheol facing the original charges without the documentation you provided. He paused. That's going to take time, and it's going to require you to cooperate with people you don't want to cooperate with. Victor was quiet for a moment. You're asking me to undo a deal I just made. I'm asking you to correct a mistake, Cassian said. You're good at making arrangements. Make a different one. The father and son looked at each other across the restaurant, across the candlelight and the scattered money and the remains of the evening, and what passed between them was not resolution. Resolution was too clean a word for it, and the story was too old for anything to be resolved in a single night in a single room. But something shifted in the distance between them that hadn't shifted before. A degree, maybe two, in the set of their shoulders toward rather than away from each other. "I'll need time," Victor said. "You have it," Cassian said. Park Jin-yoon had been waiting against the wall with the patience of someone who has understood for the past hour that his moment will come and is not going to come quickly. He stepped forward now with a care that was almost comical after the evening's events, the manager's instinct to manage surviving even the ruin of everything he'd been managing. "Mr. Varga," he said. To Cassian, not Victor. He'd calibrated that correctly. "Regarding the building, the lease terms are under review," Cassian said without looking at him. "The health and labor inspections begin at 7 tomorrow morning. If the findings are what I expect, the lease will not be renewed." He paused. "Every employee who participated in tonight's treatment of Miss Bennett will receive documentation of what occurred from my attorneys. What their current employers choose to do with that documentation is their business." Park absorbed this with the expression of a man watching his 7 years dissolve. "And the restaurant itself, that depends," Cassian said, "on what Miss Bennett decides she wants done with the space." Park blinked. "I'm sorry?" Cassian looked at Zuri. She looked back at him. "You're giving me a restaurant," she said. "I'm asking what you want," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at the space, at the stone floor and the tall windows and the amber light and the empty tables, at the candles burned down to stubs and the linen gone crooked in the evening's turbulence, at the money still on the floor, which nobody had touched for 2 hours, which had been lying there through the entirety of everything that had followed its being thrown, the most honest thing in the room. She thought about what a space this size could hold, not what it had been holding, what it could hold instead. "I want it cleaned," she said. "Floor to ceiling. I want that," she indicated the money, "documented, photographed, and donated in full to an organization that works with discrimination victims. I want it done publicly, with a statement from this restaurant acknowledging what occurred here tonight." She paused. "And then I want 6 months to decide what I want to do with the lease, without pressure, without anyone telling me what would be appropriate." She looked at Cassian when she said the last part. He received it without deflection. 6 months, he said. "Yes." She looked at Mira. Mira looked back at her. The night had taken something from Mira that wasn't coming back. Not tonight, possibly not for a long time. The architecture of the plan she'd built, the social scaffolding she'd constructed, the future she'd been certain was hers. All of it had been disassembled by the consequences of a jealousy she'd decided to act on instead of examine. She looked like what she was, a 23-year-old woman sitting in the rubble of her own worst decision. "Your design work," Zuri said. "I've seen it. The collection you were building for the Choi Showcase before you pulled it." Mira's expression shifted. Professor Yim showed me your sketches, months ago, before the competition." Zuri paused. "It was good, Mira. The textile work especially." She held Mira's gaze. "Not better than mine, but good." Mira's jaw worked. Her eyes were bright and dry, the eyes of someone using everything they have to keep a ceiling on what they're feeling. "I don't know what the right consequence for what you did tonight is," Zuri said. "I don't think you do either. I'm not going to tell you to leave school or abandon your work or shrink yourself into something that fits the shape of a punishment. That's not mine to assign." She paused. "But I need you to understand clearly that what you did tonight was not about me not deserving my work. It was about you being afraid that you deserved yours and wouldn't get it. A beat. Those are two different things. One of them is something you can actually fix." Mira looked at her for a long moment. Something was happening in her face that was too raw and too private to describe easily. Then she nodded. Not a performance nod. A small, real one. The nod of someone receiving something they didn't expect and can't yet process, but are willing to carry. Zuri picked up the jacket from where she'd placed it on the table beside the envelope and held it toward Cassian. He took it. "I need to go home," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have school tomorrow. I have a critique at 9. "I know," he said, though he couldn't have known. He said it the way you say something when the specific details don't matter and the truth underneath them does. I know that you have a life. I know that this night does not constitute the whole of it. I know that the world continues beyond this room." She looked at him. The evening had been so many things. It had been the worst night of her adult life, and it had been, in some way she wasn't ready to articulate yet, a night that had stripped everything unnecessary away and left her with the unobstructed view of what remained when there was nothing left to pretend about. She knew what she was worth. She'd known it before she walked in, but knowing something and standing in it when every voice in the room is telling you differently are two separate skills, and she had used the second one tonight in ways she would be paying for in different currencies for weeks. "The jacket," she said. "Earlier, you didn't hesitate." "No," he said. "Why?" He considered the question, not in the way people consider questions to construct answers, but in the way people consider questions that have answers they've already thought about but haven't said. "Because the moment required it," he said, "and because you were still standing." She looked at him. "You said that before. That I was still standing." "Yes." "Why does that matter to you?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the February street was still and cold, the black vehicles still at the curb, the white car beside them, the city moving around all of it with the indifference of a city that has seen everything and continues anyway. "Because most people would have left," he said. "I've watched people leave rooms they should have stayed in my entire life." He paused. "You stayed." She held his gaze for a long moment, in which the restaurant, the journalists, the people at their tables, the money on the floor, the guttered candles, all of it receded slightly, the way background recedes when two people in the foreground are actually looking at each other. Then she picked up her bag from where it had sat, untouched, under the table she had been led to at the beginning of the evening. She smoothed the front of her emerald dress. She checked the seam at the side, the one she'd been most worried about, and found it exactly as she'd left it. Perfect, holding, made to last. She walked toward the door. At the threshold she stopped, not because she needed to, but because the moment seemed to require acknowledgement of its own weight. She turned back and looked at the restaurant one last time, at the room that had tried so hard to make her smaller and had failed, at the people still sitting in the wreckage of what they'd built, at the money on the floor that was about to become something other than what it had been thrown as, at the man in the white shirt standing in the center of the room with his jacket back over his arm, watching her go with the expression of someone who has found something he thought he'd lost the capacity to recognize. She met his eyes. "Cassian," she said. "Yes." "Your sister's hand," she said. "In October." She held mine for a long time. Something moved in his face, deep and quick, like something surfacing. "I know," he said. "She told me." Zuri nodded once. Then she turned and pushed through the door and stepped out into the February cold that hit her bare arms the same way it had hit them at the beginning of the evening, real and sharp and honest in the way that only cold air is honest, the way it makes no accommodation for what you've been through or who you've become, or how long you've spent building the things you've built. She stood on the pavement for a moment. The city moved around her, cars and streetlights, and the distant sound of something that might have been music from somewhere she couldn't identify. The kind of ordinary night that has no idea what just happened to the person standing inside it. She looked up at the sky above the Gangnam roof lines, the dark February sky with its cold and distant lights, and she breathed in and breathed out, and the breath fogged in front of her face and disappeared, and she let it. Then she began to walk. Not quickly, not slowly, with the steady, unhurried, head-level walk of a woman who has somewhere to be in the morning, a critique at 9, a collection to defend, a future to construct from the materials available, and who has been moving toward it all along, even when the room she was walking through was trying its hardest to convince her that she wasn't. Behind her, through the tall windows of Soir restaurant, the last candles were burning down to the end of themselves, and the emerald dress caught the light one final time, and it was extraordinary, and it held.